Hey guys, tonight we were doing something a little reckless. You're climbing into a boxcar in the middle of the Great Depression. The train lurches, metal groans under your feet, and you realise this is no cosy passenger ride with plush seats and meal service. Nope, you're clinging to wood and iron, wind slapping your face, with nothing in your pockets except maybe a bent spoon and a prayer, and just so you know, you probably won't survive this. Not the whole journey. Hobos in the 1930s lived hard and many didn't make it to the other side, but here you are, leaning into the roar of the rails, trying to taste what freedom and desperation mixed together feel like. Before we roll deeper, quick reality check. This channel doesn't survive on beans and boxcars like Hobos did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't do it out of pity, Hobos would hate that. They wanted respect, not handouts. Oh, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I imagine it's a little past bedtime, or maybe way too late if you're on a phone under the covers. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The train is rattling west. You can't see much except moonlight glinting off the steel rails stretching endlessly into the night. There's a smell of coal smoke and dust, a taste of grit on your teeth. Your stomach growls, but you don't even bother clutching it anymore. It's been days since you had a proper meal. Hunger becomes background noise, like the clack-clack rhythm under your boots. You're officially part of a secret world. America's drifting army of the unemployed, the hobos. Here's a historical fact to ground you. By 1933, when the Depression hit its darkest point, about 25% of Americans were out of work. That's 1 in 4 adults. With jobs gone, savings evaporated, and banks collapsing, thousands, mostly men but also women and kids, took to the rails looking for any scrap of work or food. They weren't tourists, they weren't adventurers, they were desperate, but they wrapped that desperation in a rough kind of pride. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Hobos had their own kind of travel hacks, one of the strangest. Using axle grease from the trains themselves as hair pomade. Picture it, dirty, sunburned, shoes falling apart, but with a slick, combed style that said, "I may be broke, but I'm still me." You can almost smell it, thick and oily, glinting in the sunlight when they jump down into a town. Hobos weren't trying to vanish into shame, they were trying to keep a little dignity alive in the middle of chaos. But here's where scholars still argue. Were hobos symbols of resilience? Romantic wanderers proving you could survive with nothing but wits and grit? Or were they evidence of a broken society, a nation failing its people? Some historians paint them as noble outcasts, even folk heroes, while others stress the misery and violence of the road, and the truth probably rattles somewhere between those two poles, like the train you're riding now, half freedom, half nightmare. You crouch low in the boxcar as the train thunders through a yard. Lanterns swing in the dark. Somewhere, a railroad bull, basically a hired enforcer, might be waiting with a club or a dog to knock you off. Getting caught means a beating, maybe jail. You press yourself against the cold boards, heart hammering, trying not to cough as dust chokes the air. The thrill of it all, mixed with fear, makes your pulse feel like part of the train's rhythm. The train clears the yard. The stars widen overhead. Another hobo sits across from you, a shadow with a hat brim low over his eyes. He offers you half a cigarette, already bent and crumbling. You don't ask where it came from, he doesn't ask your name. On the rails, you're nobody and everybody. Conversation starts with stories, not introductions. He might tell you about riding up from Oklahoma, about picking fruit in California, about how he lost his last pair of shoes crossing Missouri. The tales aren't polished. They're smoke and ash, scattered by the wind of the moving train. You feel your eyelids sag, but you know better than to fall fully asleep. Trains jolt, people get overthrown. Worse, someone might decide you're easier to rob when you're snoring. Still, your head dips against the wooden slats. You dream of food you can't afford, pies cooling onto windowsills, chicken stews thick with potatoes. Hunger writes your dreams for you now. Somewhere in the dark, the other hobo hums a tune. It's not a full song, just a few notes, carried low so the wind doesn't steal them all away. Railroad songs are the lullabies of this strange world. Half comfort, half mourning evening. It's funny. You're cold, starving, and risking your neck, but the hum makes you feel less alone. You let yourself sink a little deeper, rocking with the motion of the rails. This is your first night as part of the drifting nation. Tomorrow you'll wake stiff, dirty, and still hungry, but the road will stretch on. For now, the train is your bed, the stars your ceiling, and survival your only job. Welcome to the Brotherhood of the Lost and Restless. The train rattles to a stop at dawn, brakes screeching like some wounded beast, and you stumble off with legs that feel like jelly. The ground is damp with dew, your shoes soak through immediately, and you shuffle toward the thin smoke rising beyond the tracks. What you find is no tidy neighbourhood with porches and picket fences, but a sprawling cluster of cardboard, tin and scrapwood huts, one of the many shantytowns people will later call Hoovervilles, after President Hoover, the guy everyone blamed for letting things fall apart. The name sticks like a cruel joke because these places aren't towns in the proud sense. They're a patchwork of desperation, stitched together from whatever the city's garbage had to offer. The huts smell of old wood, tar paper, and human sweat. Some lean like drunks, one storm away from collapse. Others are surprisingly clever, built with layered tin and even little chimneys rigged from stovepipes. A woman ladles watery stew into bowls carved from cans, and a child pokes the dirt with a stick, pretending it's a toy horse. You can't help but feel that these aren't just shelters, they're testaments to sheer human stubbornness. People refused to vanish, so they built their own cities out of scraps. Here's a hard historical fact. At the height of the Depression, there were Hoovervilles in nearly every major US city. The one in Seattle sprawled across 9 acres. New York had several, one smack in Central Park. They weren't hidden ghettos. They were visible reminders of a country cracking at the seams. If you lived in a nice house uptown, you couldn't stroll past the park without seeing the tin-roofed shacks and smoke rising from trash fires. And now for something a little quirkier. Inside these rough huts, people sometimes decorated with whatever they could salvage. Wallpaper made of newspaper pages, tin lids nailed up like picture frames, even flower pots carved from old cans. Imagine waking up to yesterday's headlines pasted above your bed, or a wall covered in comics that gave a splash of colour to an otherwise grey life. It's the sort of thing that makes you shake your head. People literally lived inside the day's bad news. But scholars debate this. Were Hoovervilles symbols of community strength or evidence of social collapse? Some historians argue they showed resilience. Neighbours pulling together, sharing food, building rules out of chaos. Others see them as failure in its purest form. A government leaving citizens to rot while pretending prosperity was around the corner. The shacks were both home and indictment, hope and humiliation. Depending on who you ask, they're remembered as either the proof of human ingenuity or scars of neglect. You wander deeper into the shantytown, stepping carefully over muddy ruts. A man offers you a seat on an overturned crate. His face is lined, his clothes patched and repatched, but he carries himself like a mayor of sorts. In fact, many Hoovervilles had informal leaders, folks who organised who got which shack, kept the peace and tried to prevent theft. He asks you where you've come from, and though you don't have much of a story yet, you mumble something about hopping trains out of Chicago. He nods knowingly, as if he's heard that story 1,000 times before. Kids dart between the huts, laughing in short bursts, as if even they know joy is rationed. A boy balances on a plank like it's a circus act. His little sister trails behind with a stick, pretending it's a magic wand. Their game seems absurd against the backdrop of crumbling shelters, but children have a way of making anything into play. You feel a stab of envy at their ability to carve fun from thin air. As you walk further, you pass a shack with a smoky little stove inside. Someone is frying potatoes, and the smell is enough to make your knees buckle. You almost knock on the door, but the hobo code you picked up warns against it. Don't beg in places where folks are just as broke as you. Still the scent clings to you, as if teasing. A wiry man strums a guitar nearby, singing in a voice that wavers between cheer and sorrow. His song is about a farm he lost, about a woman who left, about the endless road. You don't catch every word, but the emotion digs under your ribs. The Hooverville is alive with this strange mix, music and misery, play and hunger, order and ruin. Night creeps in again, shadows crawling over the cardboard walls. Fires spark up, circles of warmth where strangers gather to share stories and beans stretched thin with water. Someone ladles you at a tin cup of stew. Tastes mostly of salt and smoke, but it's the best thing you've had in days. You hunch close to the fire, clutching the cup, grateful for its heat against your palms. The flames crackle, the guitar twangs, and for a fleeting moment, this place of poverty feels almost like a village. You realise that surviving here isn't just about having shelter. It's about sharing space, scraps, and stories. Alone, you'd freeze or starve. Together, you can scrape by another day. Tomorrow, the train will call you back, but tonight, the Hooverville has taken you in. You wake stiff from the hard ground of the Hooverville, cardboard pressed against your cheek, and your first sight is the chalk mark scrawled on the side of a shack. It's a simple symbol, 2 half circles like a broken smile, but you've already learned enough to know it means kind-hearted woman lives here. You rub the sleep out of your eyes and grin. The hobo world isn't just about scraps and trains. It's stitched together with a secret language, the hobo code. Without it, you're wandering blind. With it, you're walking through a world mapped by generosity, warnings, and whispered advice. You step outside, and sure enough, the woman the mark hinted at appears. She's middle-aged, hair pulled back with a scarf, holding a ladle like it's a scepter. She doesn't look rich, but she offers you a cup of weak coffee without you even asking. That chalk symbol was no lie. This is how hobos survived, not with cash in their pockets, but with codes scratched onto fence posts, gates and walls. It was the Yelp review system of the 1930s, except you didn't need Wi-Fi, just a stub of chalk and a steady hand. Here's the historical fact to keep in your back pocket. The hobo code really existed. A system of marks that could tell you everything from safe camp here to angry dog inside or police not friendly. The symbols were intentionally simple so anyone could draw them quickly before moving on. Some were circles, others triangles, and a few looked like crude stick figures. The point wasn't art, it was survival. Now for the quirky nugget. Some hobos supposedly added playful twists to the code. For instance, if someone drew a cat-like symbol, it meant the lady of the house was kind, but she'd probably talk your ear off. Or a pair of cat ears might signal, act charming, this one likes flattery. Imagine being so hungry you'd have to rehearse compliments before knocking on the door. Lovely curtains, ma'am. Yes, I'll take those leftovers now. Of course, not everyone agrees on how widespread the code actually was. That's the scholarly debate. Some argue it was mostly mythologized later, a kind of romantic storytelling about hobos having this underground network. Others believe it was absolutely vital, especially when rail riders drifted through towns they'd never seen before. Was it a universal system, or just a patchwork of local traditions? The truth, as always, probably sits somewhere in the middle. You wander out of the Hooverville with your coffee warming your hands following a fence line. There, scratched faintly into the wood, is a symbol that looks like a crescent moon. You squint. An older hobo sees you puzzling and chuckles. "Means safe to sleep here, kid." He pats the ground under the fence where the grass lies flat from many bodies before you. Sure enough, a hidden corner that town cops probably overlook. You imagine rolling up in your thin coat there tonight, soothed by the idea that the moon-shaped chalk mark gave you permission. Walking further, you stumble on another cluster of markings near a back gate. One is an X, which the older hobo explains means good place for a handout. Another is a sharp, jagged line. That means a mean man lives inside. Don't bother knocking. Suddenly the town seems less like a maze, and more like a secret map only a few can read. Every post and doorframe becomes a page of a silent story written by travellers before you. Later you test it out. You knock at the X house. A thin, tired woman eyes you through the door. Before you can speak, she slips you half a loaf of stale bread. She doesn't ask your name, doesn't scold you, just nods, like she's already seen 100 like you this week. You thank her softly, bread clutched like treasure. And you can't help but marvel. The code worked. At night, when the stars rise again, you gather with others near a fire. And someone scratches a fresh symbol into the dirt, a circle with 2 arrows pointing away. It means keep moving, no work here. The chalk, the charcoal, the knife scratches in wood. They are like breadcrumbs across America. You realise you're part of a chain stretching from one coast to the other, an invisible community connected not by money or government, but by marks that fade with rain yet carry enormous weight while they last. You chew your bread slowly, savouring every stale bite. The flames dance on the faces of strangers who, for tonight, feel like family. One man mutters that tomorrow he'll head toward the next harvest. Another brags about a lady in Iowa who gave him pie. A third warns about a sheriff in Kansas who'd as soon shoot a hobo as chase one off. All their stories hinge on those little chalk marks. To outsiders, they are meaningless doodles. To you, they're lifelines. When you finally lie down under the fence, belly slightly less empty, you trace an imaginary circle in the dirt beside you. A private vow to pass on the code tomorrow, to leave a mark for the next lost soul. The stars blur as sleep pulls you under, and you know now, words aren't the only language keeping you alive. Sometimes survival is written in chalk. The next evening, you follow the scent of spook drifting down by the river, where the rails curve into a shadowed grove of trees. What you find is a hobo jungle, a loose camp of makeshift tents, lean-tos, and open fires dotted along the water's edge. It's not pretty. There are tin cans scattered around, clothes strung up on branches to dry, and the smell of burnt beans thick in the air. But it's alive, and that makes it home for tonight. Every hobo jungle is different, but they all share the same essentials: a fire at the centre, a pot balanced precariously on stones, and a shifting circle of men who look half dead from the road but still find a way to laugh. You edge closer, stomach dragging you in like a hook. A man with a wiry beard is stirring beans in a battered tin pot. Another is fishing hunks of stale bread from a sack. Nobody owns the fire. It belongs to everyone. You toss in a chunk of wood you carried, earning a nod of approval. That's the price of admission. Contribute something, even if it's just a story, a song, or the strength to keep the flames alive. Here's the historical anchor. Hobo jungles really were widespread during the Depression, often sprouting near rail yards or rivers. They weren't chaotic free-for-alls. Many had informal rules. Don't steal, don't hog the beans. Don't stir trouble with the locals. Violating these unspoken laws could get you booted, or worse. Survival depended on trust, and though the camps looked ragged, they were tightly knit by necessity. Now, for the quirky bit, some jungles had their own version of mealtime entertainment. If you played an instrument, told a joke, or even pulled off a magic trick, you'd be expected to perform after dinner. Imagine a ragged man in patched clothes producing coins from thin air, or strumming a guitar so battered it's missing half its strings, but still coaxing out a tune. It wasn't Broadway, but under the stars. It was good enough to keep spirits from collapsing entirely. And here's the debate scholars still chew on. Were hobo jungles truly safe spaces, or were they magnets for violence and crime? Some memoirs paint them as sanctuaries where strangers became brothers. Others describe knife fights, theft, and exploitation. The truth, again, is messy. Depending on who you met, a jungle could be salvation or a trap. For you tonight, though, it leans toward the former. You take a seat on a log and accept a dented tin cup of beans. They're smoky, watery, and packed with more weevils than you'd like to admit, but the first bite is heaven compared to empty nights. You slurp slowly, watching sparks float up into the sky. Around the fire, men swap fragments of their lives. One used to be a tailor in St. Louis. Another lost his farm in Nebraska when the bank foreclosed. A third says nothing at all, just stares into the fire with eyes that seem burned out. Conversation drifts to survival tricks, how to stretch a sack of potatoes for a week, how to sneak coal off trains for winter fires, how to dodge the bulls in the rail yards. Every tale is half instruction manual, half confession. You realise this is the true University of the Road, lessons passed mouth to mouth, with beans as tuition. Someone starts singing low, a folk tune about the endless line of tracks. Soon others join in, voices ragged but strangely beautiful in harmony. You hum along, even though you barely know the words. The rhythm of the song mixes with the crackle of fire, the croak of frogs by the river, and the deep rumble of a train somewhere in the distance. It feels like the earth itself is humming with you. Later, you're assigned a sleeping spot, a patch of ground near the riverbank. No mattress, just dirt softened by years of other drifters. You curl up with your thin coat pulled tight, listening to the whispers fade into snores around you. Every so often someone coughs, or a dog barks far off, but mostly the night is calm. You wonder how many others have lain exactly where you are, staring at the same stars, hoping for the same luck tomorrow. In the morning, the fire's coals are grey, and the jungle looks like it's already half disappearing. Hobos don't linger long, they move on, cattering like smoke. You stamp your boots, shake off the dirt, and get ready to follow the next track. Before leaving, you scratch a small mark on a tree, a circle with a dot inside, meaning safe camp here. It's your way of saying thanks, and of leaving a breadcrumb for the next stranger stumbling hungry and lost down this same path. The road calls again, and you answer the only way you can, by climbing into another boxcar. This time you're not alone. Half a dozen men pile in with you, some quiet, others cracking jokes like it's a poker table instead of a rattling coffin on wheels. You settle against the rough planks, knees pulled up, and listen as the train shudders into motion. The boxcar rattles, the air fills with dust, and the long ride begins. Out here, conversation is currency. You don't buy companionship with dollars, you buy it with stories. One man, gaunt and sharp-eyed, tells you he once worked as a coal miner in Pennsylvania. "Hardest job I ever had," he mutters, "and I've been starving for 2 years." Another laughs and says he used to be a barber. He pulls a pair of dull scissors from his bag, offering to trim anyone's hair for half a crust of bread. A third man doesn't say what he did before. Instead, he launches into a tale about jumping a train in Kansas, hanging on by one hand while the bull swung at him with a stick. He exaggerates, of course, everyone does, but exaggeration is part of the ritual. Here's the historical truth tucked in. The rails became a lifeline for thousands of unemployed men during the Depression. And estimates say more than 50,000 people, nicknamed hobos, roamed the country this way. They weren't the aimless bums people sneered about. Most were chasing rumours of work moving like human shadows across the land. The train wasn't just transport, it was survival, a chance to roll toward hope, however faint. And for the quirky detail, boxcar rides had their own kind of etiquette. You never took the best corner if an older man needed it. You shared tobacco when you had it. And, oddly enough, some men carved their initials into the wood along with little poems or crude drawings, graffiti long before it was cool. Imagine leaning back against a plank and noticing someone scratched. St. Louis, I'm 32, still alive. It's like a time capsule left by another survivor who wanted the world, or at least the next rider, to know they hadn't disappeared completely. The debate that lingers among historians is this: did these boxcar conversations build a real sense of community, or were they just fleeting distractions to numb the misery? Some memoirs describe them as lifelines, the glue holding men together through endless nights. Others argue they were shallow exchanges, forgotten the second boots hit dirt again. Either way, in that rattling dark, stories mattered. Maybe they didn't last forever, but for a few hours they gave the illusion of connection. Your boxcar shakes violently, tossing everyone like dice. The barber catches himself on a nail, swearing as his palm splits. Another man tears a strip from his shirt to bind it. Nobody has antiseptic, but the gesture is enough to keep the moment human. The coal miner starts humming low, then turns the hum into a song about the old days in the pit. Soon the barber joins in, his voice raspy, and even you mumble along, though you don't know the tune. The rhythm of the rails becomes the drum beat. Later, as the train slows for a crossing, someone digs out a harmonica. The notes are sharp, wild, cutting through the wind. For a second, the boxcar transforms, no longer a crate of starving men, but a rolling concert hall. The music doesn't erase hunger or fear, but it paints over them just enough to make you forget. You close your eyes and let the sound carry you, imagining it drifting out through the cracks of the car, across the fields and towns, announcing, "We're still here." By midnight, the stories quiet down. Men slump against the walls, some snoring, some staring blankly at the stars through the open door. You fight sleep, knowing how easy it is to get thrown when the train jolts. Still, exhaustion wins. You dream of a kitchen table back home, of bread that doesn't crumble in your hands, of coffee that doesn't taste like ash water. When dawn breaks, the train screeches into another yard. The men wake groggy, stretching stiff limbs. Someone claps you on the back, another mutters a goodbye. And just like that, the fellowship dissolves. Each man jumps down, heading his own direction, stories already swallowed by the noise of the town. You hop down last, boots hitting gravel. The boxcar rattles away empty, carrying only the ghosts of conversations that got you through the night. You barely make it 2 blocks into town before realizing the real danger isn't hunger or cold, it's the men patrolling the rail yards with clubs in hand. They are called bulls, the hired muscle of the railroad companies, and their entire job is to keep people like you off the trains. You'd think a company that's already losing money might be too busy to worry about a few freeloaders, but no, hobos cost them time, fines and accidents, so they pay bulls to make examples. And the examples usually involve fists, boots, or the kind of dogs that don't wag their tails. You slip behind a stack of crates, crouching low as a bull passes. His lantern beam swings across the gravel, catching dust like gold flecks in the air. Your heart hammers as he mutters something to the dog at his side. You've heard the stories, guys getting their skulls cracked for daring to ride without a ticket, tossed into ditches like garbage. Some survive with nothing worse than bruises, others don't. You hold your breath until his light disappears, then exhale so hard it feels like your ribs might collapse. Here's the cold historical fact. The railroad bulls were feared across the country, and they weren't shy about violence. Newspapers occasionally printed stories of men beaten senseless just for hopping a train. In some towns, the bulls worked hand in hand with local cops to keep transients moving, making sure hobos never stayed long enough to cause trouble. Trouble, of course, usually meant existing while broke. Now for the strange, almost comical twist. Some hobos claimed they could identify bulls by their footsteps. Heavy, dragging steps meant an older man with bad knees, easier to outrun. Sharp, quick steps meant a younger one, eager to swing. A few even joked that bulls should be ranked like baseball players, with stats on how many heads they'd cracked that season. Dark humour was the only way to make the risk feel less terrifying. But here's where historians still wrestle with the truth. Were bulls truly as brutal as the legend suggests, or did hobo lore exaggerate their violence into myth? Some accounts portray them as ruthless thugs who left bodies behind the tracks. Others suggest many were just working men themselves, trying to keep order in dangerous yards. The debate simmers because so many stories came second-hand, told around fires by men who swore their scars had come from a bull's club. Memory, fear and myth blur together in the dark. You creep through the yard, ears tuned for every crunch of gravel. Ahead, you spot a group of men crouched near the edge of a boxcar, waiting for the right moment to swing inside. You start toward them, but a sudden bark freezes you. The dog is back, closer this time, hackles raised. A lantern beam cuts across the tracks, catching your jacket. The bull shouts, voiced like a gunshot. Instinct takes over. You bolt, feet pounding on gravel, lungs burning. The train whistles in the distance, mocking your sprint. You dive behind a row of coal cars, pressing your body into the shadow, the stink of dust and iron filling your nose. The lantern light sweeps past but doesn't catch you this time. The bull curses and moves on, his dog whining. You don't move until the sounds fade completely. When you finally climb aboard a car at the edge of the yard, your hands are shaking so badly you nearly sip. Inside, two hobos nod at you knowingly. One shows you the bruises on his arm, deep purple and swollen. "Got caught in St. Louis last week," he mutters. Another spits and says, "You don't win against bulls, you just stay lucky." You nod, though your heart's still galloping from your close call. The train lurches forward. You collapse against the wall, still trembling, realizing how thin the line is between freedom and a beating. Out here, every ride is a gamble, every mile borrowed. Survival isn't just about food or fire, it's about dodging the men whose job is to remind you the rails don't belong to you. Night comes again, and as you drift in uneasy half-sleep, you wonder how many hobos didn't wake after a run-in with the bulls. Maybe their stories live on in whispered warnings, maybe they just vanished between towns, remembered only by a few chalk marks left behind. Either way, the bulls are always out there, lanterns swinging, dogs snarling, waiting for the next desperate soul to slip. The boxcar rocks you through another night, and when daylight spills in through the cracks, you're greeted not by fists or dogs, but by something softer. Music. A young man sitting near the open door pulls a battered guitar from its sack. The wood is scarred, the strings look half rust, but when he strums, the sound fills the car like a warm sunrise. His voice is low, gravelly from too many cigarettes and too much dust, but steady. He sings about going down the line, about rivers that never end, about women whose names you'll never know. It's not polished, not Broadway, yet it's exactly what you needed. Music rides the rails as much as hobos do. Harmonicas are cheap, guitars get patched and repatched, and voices are free. Songs become a currency, traded for a chunk of bread, a smoke, or just a place near the fire. And for hobos, music isn't just entertainment. It's therapy, memory, and rebellion rolled together. The Depression robbed people of money and jobs, but it couldn't silence them. Here's your grounded fact. Many of the folk songs we think of as classic Americana were shaped or carried forward by hobos. Tunes like Big Rock Candy Mountain or endless variations of train ballads weren't written in studios. They were born in boxcars and passed through jungles, reshaped by every voice that sang them. The rails weren't just iron lines across the country, they were arteries carrying culture, spreading verses faster than radio ever could. And for the quirky tidbit, some hobos treated their harmonicas like prized possessions. naming them as if they were pets. "This here's Daisy," one might say, patting the dented little instrument. Losing it was worse than losing a shirt. A harmonica could fill an empty stomach for a few minutes with sound instead of food. Some men even carved messages onto their instruments, tiny scratches that told where they'd been, like a travel diary that sang back when you blew into it. The debate historians still toss around is whether hobo music was truly its own distinct culture or just borrowed scraps of mainstream songs. Did these rail riders invent new traditions, or did they simply carry popular tunes into the camps? Some argue the jungles were creative hubs, melting pots where new verses and rhythms were born. Others insist they were more like relay stations, passing along songs from one region to the next. Either way, the tracks echoed with music, and the echoes still reach us today. The young man with the guitar keeps playing as the boxcar rattles along. Soon others join in. One man hums, another slaps his knee in rhythm, and before long the whole car has become a ramshackle choir. You add your voice too, even if it's off-key. It doesn't matter. The music smooths the edges of hunger and fear. For a little while, the boxcar isn't just a rolling cage, it's a stage, and everyone's part of the band. That night, when the train slows near a small town, you and a few others hop off and head for the edge of a hobo jungle. A fire flickers in the distance, and as you approach, you hear the unmistakable sound of another harmonica, sharp and sweet in the night air. Around the flames, men and women sit close, tapping their feet, swaying to the rhythm. A woman with a scarf tied around her head sings a ballad so raw it hushes the crowd. She doesn't sound like she's performing, she sounds like she's remembering. The song is about her farm, about her children sleeping in another town, about how the train tracks carry her away from everything she once knew. You sit there in the firelight, belly empty but spirit unexpectedly full. Music doesn't put bread in your hand or coal in your pocket, but it makes the emptiness bearable. It's a bridge from one lost soul to another, a reminder that none of you are truly invisible. Tomorrow you'll be scattered again, one headed north, another west, another maybe nowhere at all. But tonight, you share a rhythm that makes the cold sting a little less. When the last notes fade, the fire crackles louder, and the stars above seem to lean closer. You stretch out on the dirt, the melody still humming in your bones. The rails will always be harsh, the bulls will always swing their clubs, but at least you know now there's music hiding in the rattles, waiting to surface whenever someone's brave enough to strum, blow or sing. The morning sun breaks hot, painting the jungle in gold that feels almost dishonest, like the light has no right to make poverty look pretty. You rise stiff, brush dirt from your sleeves and hear the chatter about crops. It's September, which means harvest season in the Midwest, and rumours ripple through the camp like gospel. Apples in Michigan, wheat in Kansas, hops in Oregon. The hobos don't trade stock tips or office gossip, they trade news of fields where a man can trade sweat for a plate of food and maybe a nickel or two. This is the rhythm of the road, following the seasons like migratory birds, except the flight path is across endless fields of corn and orchards heavy with fruit. You head with a group toward town, shoes slapping dust, stomach urging you faster. A farmer leans against his truck near the square, hat low, scanning the crowd of ragged faces. He needs pickers, and you need him. The deal is unspoken but universal. He offers a day's labour for pennies or meals, no contract, no security, just sweat for survival. Here's the historical backbone. Seasonal agricultural labour during the Depression was a lifeline for countless hobos. Entire communities of migrants formed around harvests, moving from cotton fields in the south to fruit orchards in California. They weren't protected by unions, paid minimum wage or given housing. Often they slept in barns or under trees, and the pay barely covered a day's food. Still, it was better than starving on the rails. And for the quirkier side, some farmers paid not in money, but in meals. All you can eat became the most valuable wage a hobo could ask for. Stories tell of workers devouring mountains of mashed potatoes, biscuits, and meat after 12 hours of labour. One farm wife supposedly put a sign on her door, "Eat all you can, but leave before the cows come home." The men laughed and ate like kings, then vanished with bellies finally full. The scholarly debate lingers around this labour migration. Were hobos and migrant workers exploited mercilessly, trapped in cycles of underpaid toil, or did they retain a degree of agency, choosing mobility over being shackled to failing towns? Some historians emphasise the exploitation, pointing to malnutrition and child labour in the fields. Others argue that drifting workers carved out their own form of independence, moving freely and refusing to be tied down to hopeless places. The argument, much like the fields themselves, stretches on endlessly. You take your turn in an apple orchard, climbing ladders that wobble dangerously, hands raw from reaching, shoulders aching from the sack pulling heavy at your side. The sun beats down, sweat stings your eyes, and your stomach growls louder than the cicadas. By the time the farmer calls it quits, your body feels like it's been wrung dry. But then comes the prize, a long table set with steaming potatoes, bread, thick gravy, and cider so fresh it tastes like sunlight itself. You shovel food into your mouth with both hands, barely pausing to breathe. Hunger makes you shameless, and for once nobody cares. Everyone's doing the same. Night falls and you bed down in the barn with the others, the smell of hay and sweat mixing in the air. A man nearby snores so loudly it sounds like a sawmill. Another hums softly, too tired for full songs but unwilling to let the day end in silence. You curl into your coat, muscles screaming but stomach satisfied for the first time in weeks. The next morning the farmer hands you a few coins, barely enough to buy a sandwich in town. You weigh them in your palm, wondering whether to hold on to them or trade them for one last hot meal before the rails call again. Either way, the harvest has brought you another day, maybe two. And out here, that's what survival looks like. A day at a time, field by field, crop by crop, always moving with the seasons. You glance back at the orchard as you leave, rows of trees fading in the dawn haze. You know you'll never see this farm again, but for a brief moment, it was home. Tomorrow it'll be another field, another farmer, another gamble. The road stretches endlessly, stitched together by sweat and rumours. And you follow it because the alternative is nothing at all. Your coat is threadbare, your shoes are barely shoes anymore, and your reflection in a puddle makes you look like someone escaped from a rag bin. Clothes on the road aren't fashion, they're survival stitched together with whatever you can beg, borrow, or rip off the side of a grain sack. The longer you wander, the more you realise hobos wore their history right on their sleeves, quite literally patched together, piece by piece. In the jungle, a man shows you how to turn a flour sack into a shirt. He soaks it in lye water to scrub out the brand name, though sometimes he leaves it just for the laugh. Imagine walking into town with gold medal flour stenciled across your chest. Pants are patched with fabric so mismatched they look like checkerboards. Jackets are lined with newspaper for insulation, rustling like whispers every time you move. And shoes, well, calling them shoes is generous. Cardboard soles tied with string, worn-out boots stuffed with rags, even scraps of tyre rubber nailed to the bottoms. You don't walk in style, you walk in noise, squeaking, crunching, and clattering down the tracks. Here's the historical fact to hang on to. By the early 1930s, clothing charities were stretched so thin that many people really did live in patched garments for years at a time. The Salvation Army, churches, and local relief groups offered bundles of cast-offs, but supply never matched demand. Hobos in particular relied on thrift and ingenuity. Old feed sacks became dresses, coats got turned inside out, and gloves were sometimes nothing more than socks with holes cut for fingers. Now the quirky bit. Hobos had a kind of unspoken humour about their outfits. One legend tells of a man who sewed bottle caps onto his hat brim, claiming it made him the only hobo with jewellery. Another carved buttons out of wood, insisting they were oak-polished, finest quality. It was shabby chic decades before that term ever existed. A way of laughing at the fact that you had nothing, so you might as well look ridiculous while surviving. But scholars debate how much of this hobo style was chosen versus forced. Some argue hobos leaned into their patchwork look deliberately, creating a visual identity that set them apart, even as folk heroes in songs and stories. Others suggest there was no pride in it at all, only necessity, and the songs later romanticised what was really just misery. Did they embrace the image of the patched wanderer, or did they simply have no other option? The truth, as usual, is tangled. You take stock of your own outfit, coat sleeves frayed, shirt collar half torn, shoes patched with cardboard so thin you feel every pebble. You wonder what you look like to the townsfolk as you walk past. Probably equal parts frightening and pitiful. Kids sometimes laugh, adults sometimes sneer, and yet sometimes someone presses an old jacket into your hands without a word. You slip it on like armour, even if it doesn't fit. Dignity when you're broke often arrives second-hand. At a jungle fire one night, a group of men swapped stories about their fancy clothes. One claims he once found a tuxedo jacket in a dumpster and wore it for weeks, pairing it with muddy trousers and a cap. Another laughs about a pair of women's boots he wore one whole winter, too cold to care about the heels. Each tale is absurd, but behind the laughter is a truth. Clothes might not make the man, but they certainly help him survive the cold nights. When winter looms, clothing becomes less about appearance and more about life or death. You watch a man stuff newspaper into his shirt until he looks bloated, then lie down by the fire rustling like a sack of leaves. Another ties burlap around his legs to block the wind. It doesn't work well, but it's better than nothing. You do the same, wrapping your ankles in old rags, telling yourself it's temporary, even though you know it isn't. As you bed down, you run your fingers over the patch on your knee, rough stitching done by your own clumsy hands. It's ugly, crooked, and stubbornly holding together. You realise it's a mirror of you, imperfect, patched, but still here. Tomorrow you'll walk into another town and the people there might see only a ragged drifter. But your clothes tell a deeper story, one stitch at a time, and for now they're enough to keep you alive. The fire is low tonight, smoke curling into the black sky when a voice at the edge of the jungle says, "Don't stare too long, fellas, we sing." It ain't all men out here. You look up to see a figure stepping from the shadows, trousers dusty, cap pulled low. At first glance, just another hobo. But when she drops onto a crate and pushes back her cap, you realise she's a woman. Not just passing through, not with a husband in tow, on her own. In a world where rail yards eat men alive, women who rode the rails were rare, bold and often invisible until they chose not to be. She notices the stares and laughs. "Yeah, I know. Thought I was a boy, didn't you?" Her voice is rough but steady, and her grin dares anyone to question her place here. You quickly learn this isn't unusual. Many women disguise themselves as men to survive on the road, binding their chests, cutting their hair, walking with a swagger to avoid trouble. Some kept up the act for years, passing through jungles and boxcars with no one the wiser. Here's your solid fact. Though the hobo world was overwhelmingly male, women did ride the rails during the Depression and were single, others widowed, and a few fled abusive homes or marriages. Reports from the time estimate thousands of women took to the tracks, though their numbers were never officially counted, partly because most concealed their gender. They risked double the danger: hunger, violence, and the constant threat of assault if their disguise failed. Now for the quirky twist. Women hobos sometimes developed reputations as being sharper or tougher than the men. Stories tell of one woman who carried a rolling pin in her sack, whacking any drunk who got too close. Another earned the nickname Boxcar Bessie for her quick wit and faster fists. Legend has it she once outbluffed a bull by threatening to sue the railroad for moral damages. The man was so shocked he let her go. Whether true or not, the stories became part of hobo folklore, half admiration, half myth. But here's the debate. Did women on the rails gain a kind of freedom men couldn't understand, or were they pushed into deeper vulnerability? Some historians argue the rails gave women a rare independence in an era when their lives were usually tied to husbands or fathers. Others point out the price of that freedom was brutal, constant danger and erasure from the official record. The truth, as always, is split down the middle. For every woman who thrived in disguise, another likely vanished, her story untold. Back at the fire, the woman pulls a tin harmonica from her coat and plays a tune sharp enough to cut through the night. The men who had looked at her with surprise now just listen, tapping their feet. The music settles the air. Nobody asks her name. Names don't matter much out here. What matters is that she belongs, just as much as anyone else huddled around the flames. Later she tells you her reason for riding. "I had nothing left back home," she says simply. "Figured I'd rather risk the rails than starve waiting for a miracle." She shrugs like it's the most ordinary choice in the world, Sverend. And maybe, in the 30s it was. When the fire dies, you stretch out in the dirt, hearing her soft footsteps nearby. Tomorrow she might be gone, vanished into another boxcar, another jungle. But tonight, you know she's proof the road wasn't reserved for men. The Depression didn't care about gender. Hunger made everyone equal, and the rails didn't ask for introductions. You drift towards sleep thinking about her disguise, about the courage it takes to wear someone else's skin just to stay alive. And you realise survival has no single uniform. It wears trousers, skirts, rags, or flour sacks, whatever the moment demands. Out here, you don't just ride the rails. You rewrite yourself to fit them. The train jolts you awake before dawn, and when you peer through the crack in the boxcar, you notice something small and quick darting across the yard. At first, you think it's a stray dog, but then you catch sight of a boy, barely 12, scrambling up onto the platform with the same ragged determination you've seen in men, twice his vintage. His pants are too short, his cap too big, and his eyes carry the kind of hollowness kids shouldn't know yet. He sees you looking and grins, gap-toothed, like this is all just a game. Children on the rails, road kid as some called them, were heartbreakingly common during the Depression. Many were orphans, their families torn apart by poverty. Others had parents who simply couldn't feed them, so they were sent off with the hope they'd find food or work elsewhere. Riding the rails became their playground, their school, and too often their coffin. Imagine being 12 and calling a rattling boxcar your bedroom, with splinters for pillows and hunger for a lullaby. Here's the stark historical fact: by the mid-30s, estimates suggested over 200,000 children were wandering the country as vagrants. Some were taken in by extended family or charities, but countless others slipped through the cracks, joining the tide of hobos on the move. Trains carried not just men chasing work, but whole childhoods cut loose from the stability they deserved. Now for the odd, almost unbelievable quirk. Many of these kids turned the rails into a game. They invented competitions: who could hop a car the fastest, who could balance longest on the narrow couplings between cars. Some even carved their own nicknames into the boxcar walls, creating secret reputations as if the railroads were their own clubhouse. Imagine the bravado, a 12-year-old scrawling king of the line on the wood while shivering barefoot and hungry. It was bravado masking fear, but bravado nonetheless. And here's the scholarly debate. How should we remember these children? Were they victims abandoned by a collapsing system, or were they resilient adventurers, carving freedom out of chaos? Memoirs tilt both ways. Some recall the thrill of the rails, the friendships, the wild sense of independence. Others remember only the fear, the abuse, the aching loneliness. Historians still wrestle with which lens to apply. Maybe it's both, tangled and inseparable. Back in the car, the boy introduces himself as Red, though you doubt that's his real name. He pulls a marble from his pocket, cracked and cloudy, and rolls it back and forth across the floor. "Keeps me company, Tor," he says like it's a pet. You nod, pretending not to notice how dirty his hands are or how sharp his ribs stick out through his shirt. When the train lurches, the marble rolls wild and Red scrambles after it, laughing like he's just won a prize. His laugh is thin but real, and for a moment, the boxcar feels less grim. As the day drags on, Red tells you bits of his story. His father left to find work and never came back. His mother tried, but there wasn't enough food to go around. So Red hit the rails, figuring the world couldn't be worse out here than it was at home. He says it like it's an adventure, but you see the way his eyes drop when he talks about his mother. He's playing tough, because playing tough is the only shield a kid has when the world stops caring. That night, when the train slows near another jungle, Red scampers off before you can say goodbye. You watch him vanish into the campfire glow, swallowed by a crowd of strangers. Maybe he'll find someone to look out for him, maybe not. Either way, he's gone, another ghost in the endless migration of children who learn too soon how to fend for themselves. You curl into your coat, the image of that marble still rolling in your head. The sound of Red's laugh echoes against the dark, and you realise that childhood doesn't vanish, even in a boxcar. It just gets patched together, like everything else on the road. Scraps of joy, scraps of play, scraps of memory. And if you're lucky, maybe those scraps are enough to keep the fire burning another day. The next town greets you not with open arms, but with the sight of a line stretching around the block. Men, women, even children shuffle forward, clutching tin cups, bowls, whatever vessel they could scavenge. The sign above the doorway reads simply, "Free soup today." You fall into line, shoulders sagging, and the smell of broth, thin but warm, wafts into the street. Hunger makes you patient. Hunger also makes you humble. Nobody asks names, nobody asks what you used to be. Here, the only identity that matters is hungry. Soup kitchens became the lifelines of Depression America. Churches, charities, and even notorious businessmen funded them. Chicago gangster Al Capone famously opened one, handing out free meals in a city where unemployment hovered near 50%. It was equal parts charity and public relations stunt. But for the people clutching bread rolls, motives didn't matter. A bowl of soup was survival, whether it came from a nun ladling with love or a mobster smoothing his reputation. Here's the historical fact of the night. By 1932, there were thousands of soup kitchens operating across the US, feeding millions daily. Most served bread and broth, sometimes beans if donations stretched far enough. For many, it was the only hot food they'd see all week. In photos from the era, the kitchens look orderly, but behind those still faces were rumbling stomachs and gnawing shame. And now the quirky side note, some kitchens developed reputations for extras. One in New York was known for slipping in coffee refills, another in San Francisco gave out day-old donuts once a week. Hobos passed this information like treasure maps. Entire chalk codes popped up near rail yards signalling which missions gave decent soup and which just handed out boiled water and prayers. The scholarly debate here revolves around dignity. Did soup kitchens preserve it by keeping people alive, or strip it by forcing the needy to queue publicly, bowls in hand? Some argue they reinforced shame, turning hunger into spectacle. Others insist they symbolized compassion, tangible proof that even in a broken system someone still cared. The truth probably depended on the day, the city, and the size of your hunger. Inside the mission, you shuffle forward. A nun drops a ladleful into your bowl. The broth is thin, potatoes floating like lonely islands, but it's hot. The bread is stale, but it softens when dipped. Around you, the hall hums with quiet slurps, the scrape of spoons, murmured thanks. A man at the next table cracks a joke. At least it's warmer than dishwater, and laughter ripples despite the thinness of the soup. It's proof that humour survives even when meals don't. When you finish, you linger, soaking up the warmth of the room. A preacher begins to speak, offering words about faith and endurance. Some listen, nodding slowly. Others stare blankly, too tired to care. A boy across the table tries to sneak a second roll under his shirt. You catch his eye, but instead of scolding, you give him a quick wink. You understand. Later, you step back into the chill air, stomach heavier, soul lighter. The line outside is still long, faces shifting but expressions the same. Hunger doesn't vanish just because one pot empties. You walk away with the taste of salt and starch still on your tongue, realizing soup isn't glamorous, but it keeps you standing. That night by the fire, men trade stories about the best kitchens they've found. One swears Detroit had the thickest stew, another says Los Angeles gave seconds if you looked polite enough. The conversation sounds almost like connoisseurs swapping wine notes, except their vintage is watery beans. You laugh along, even though you know tomorrow you'll be in line again somewhere else, bowl in hand, waiting for salvation one ladle at a time. The rails carry you forward, but soup kitchens carry you alive. Without them, the Depression's hunger would have swallowed even more. The taste may not linger, but the memory does. A reminder that sometimes survival boils down to hot broth, stale bread, and the small mercy of being fed at all. The next morning, you wander through town, still tasting last night's soup on your tongue. When you hear it, the muttered phrase, "damn bums." A shopkeeper scowls as you pass, his eyes sliding over your patched coat and worn-out shoes. That word, bum, sticks like a thorn. You know the truth. Hobos follow the rails chasing work. Tramps drift for the thrill, and bums, well, bums just beg. But to most townsfolk, all three are the same. The stereotype paints every rail rider as a thief, a drunk, or worse. You're not even a man anymore, you're a menace. Here's the hard historical fact. Public opinion during the Great Depression often lumped hobos in with criminals. Newspapers ran as headlines warning about transient crime waves, blaming everything from petty theft to barn fires on wandering men. Police chiefs claimed jungles were hotbeds of lawlessness, and politicians pointed to the sight of ragged figures drifting into town as proof society was under siege. Never mind that most hobos were just hungry and tired, the myth of the lawless drifter stuck. Now for the quirky twist, hobos themselves leaned into irony. Some carved fake wanted posters, sketching themselves as notorious bean thieves. Others told tall tales about stealing locomotives or outwitting sheriffs, knowing full well they were exaggerating. Storytelling became both survival and rebellion. If the world already branded you a criminal, you might as well tell the story with a wink. The scholarly debate here runs deep. Was the criminal image mostly a smear campaign, or was there truth to the fear? Some historians argue most hobos were harmless, desperate men who would rather work than steal. Others point to documented cases of theft, gang activity and violence, suggesting the hobo world had a dark underbelly. The reality probably sat on a spectrum. Most were harmless, some were dangerous, but the myth painted everyone with the same brush. You remember the code of the road. Don't steal from a hobo, don't steal from the poor, and never mess with the train crew. Yet in town, you overhear locals swapping stories about tramps breaking into houses. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but perception is as heavy as fact, and in the eyes of the townsfolk your patched coat is already evidence. That night by the jungle fire, a man with sharp cheekbones tells the story of being arrested for loitering after sitting too long on a bench. He didn't steal, didn't even beg, but the cop hauled him off anyway. Another hobo chimes in, recalling a farmer who accused him of chicken theft, though he swears he hadn't eaten meat in months. The men laugh bitterly. Doesn't matter if you're guilty, the crime is your existence. Still, you see how myths keep morale alive too. A younger hobo brags he once hopped a train right under a bull's nose, escaping with a bag of apples like Jesse James himself. The others cheer, even though everyone knows he probably found those apples in a ditch. Exaggeration is the only luxury you can afford. As the fire burns low, you realise how exhausting it is to live with the weight of suspicion. You're tired from hunger, tired from walking, tired from being called a criminal for nothing more than being broke. Yet in the jungle, surrounded by men laughing over tall tales, you feel a strange relief. Out here, myth works both ways. It paints you as a villain in town, but in the camp it lets you be a hero even for a story or two. When you finally curl up in the dirt, the crackle of fire fading, you know tomorrow the stairs will return, the whispers of thief and bum will follow you down the street. But tonight, the myths belong to you and your kind. Out here, criminals become storytellers. And storytellers, well, they survive. You drift into another town where the rail yard hums with activity, and word on the street is that tonight there's a hobo college being held in the jungle just beyond the bridge. You laugh at the name at first, college. Out here, but curiosity pulls you in. As the sun dips, you find a circle of men seated around the fire, not just swapping beans and songs, but actually teaching. One man sketches shapes in the dirt, explaining carpentry tricks. Another reads from a tattered newspaper, turning the latest headlines into a debate about whether Roosevelt's programs will save or sink the country. Welcome to higher education hobo style. Here's the solid historical fact. Hobo colleges really existed, especially in larger cities like Chicago. They weren't formal universities, of course, but informal gatherings where hobos exchanged knowledge. Some taught practical trades, plumbing tips, repair skills, how to rig a tarp so it didn't blow away in the wind. Others turned into political forums with fiery debates about communism, union organising, or whether capitalism had collapsed entirely. For men who'd lost everything, ideas became both fuel and comfort. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some of these colleges had mock professors and curriculums. One man might announce, "Tonight's lecture, the art of stealing coal without losing your teeth." Another might declare himself Dean of Boxcar Studies. After surviving 6 states without once getting caught by a bull, it was part satire, part survival. When life strips you of dignity, sometimes you put it back on with humour, even if it's just calling yourself a professor while sitting in the dirt. The scholarly debate surrounding hobo colleges is about their role in shaping labour movements. Were these gatherings simply fireside chatter, or did they actually spread political ideas that help fuel strikes and reforms? Some historians argue hobos were key in transmitting radical ideas across the country, carrying news from one city to the next like human telegraphs. Others believe the impact was minimal, more therapy than activism. The truth likely straddles both, education and entertainment blending on nights when the fire burned long. Back in the circle, the professor of the evening is an older man with glasses so cracked you wonder how he can see. He's explaining how to identify good timber for building shacks in Hoovervilles. He talks about grain knots, the way wood warps in rain. Around him, younger hobos nod like students. One even takes notes in a pocket-sized ledger, as if he'll need the exam answers later. After that, a man with a loud voice stands and declares, "Gentlemen, tonight's political lecture. Why the bosses are robbing us blind. He patin," waving his arms, quoting from pamphlets he's half memorised. Some heckle, some cheer, but everyone listens. You realise this isn't just education, it's therapy, a way of venting anger without breaking apart. Knowledge here isn't about degrees, it's about survival, about keeping your mind sharp when the world wants you dull. You lean back, warmed by the fire, and watch as the college session shifts to songs, jokes and more beans. One man recites poetry, his own rough but heartfelt. Another challenges the group to a debate about whether trains or boats make better escapes. It's absurd, but it fills the night with life. For once, the jungle doesn't feel like a graveyard of lost men. It feels like a campus buzzing with possibility. When the fire dies low, the dean declares the session adjourned, promising tomorrow's lecture will cover advanced techniques in fence jumping. Everyone laughs, and then slowly they bed down in the dirt, the wisdom of the evening lingering like smoke. You curl into your coat, thinking about how odd it is that a group of men with nothing, no jobs, no homes, no futures promised, still carve out space to learn, to argue, to teach. Poverty may have stolen their wallets, but not their curiosity, and tonight under the stars, the jungle was a classroom, and you were a student. The next town greets you with hunger gnawing your ribs again. And this time, no orchard or soup line is in sight. You've got two choices: go without, or swallow your pride and try your luck with panhandling. Out here, it isn't called begging. It's called spare changing, and it's a skill as much as it is desperation. You quickly learn there's an art to it. Stand too close and people flinch. Look too ragged and they assume you'll spend it on drink. Look too polished and they wonder why you're asking at all. It's a balancing act, a theatre of survival. Here's the historical truth. Panhandling skyrocketed during the Depression. Millions of unemployed men and women took to the streets, asking strangers for a nickel, a crust, or even just the promise of odd jobs. Cities tried to crack down, passing ordinances against loitering or vagrancy, but hunger doesn't read laws. In places like New York and Chicago, you could see lines of men with cardboard signs reading, "Hungry. Will work for food," long before that phrase became cliché. And for the quirky fact, hobos often developed little tricks to make their asking more palatable. Some would carry a broken shoe, holding it up as proof of their need. Others turned to humour, scribbling signs like, "Why lie? I want a beer." That kind of honesty sometimes got better results than a sob story. There's even a tale of one man who carried around a trained raccoon, letting it beg on its hind legs while he played the harmonica. Whether the story's true or not, the point was clear. Creativity could turn a no into a handful of coins. The debate among scholars is whether panhandling should be seen as degrading or as an expression of resilience. Was it proof that men had been stripped of dignity, reduced to begging in the streets? Or was it an example of clever adaptation, finding ways to survive when every other door was locked? Some memoirs describe the humiliation of holding out a hand. Others describe the pride in tricking money out of strangers with wit. The tension between shame and skill sits at the heart of the practice. You give it a try near the corner store, positioning yourself just far enough from the door not to spook customers. A woman walks past with a basket, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "Ma'am," you say softly, "could you spare a penny for bread?" She hesitates, then presses a coin into your palm without a word. Relief surges through you, as though that tiny circle of metal is a feast. Another man, though, spits at your feet and mutters, "Get a job!" You bite back a retort. There are no jobs, not for him, not for you. Later you watch an older hobo work the same corner with ease. He tells jokes, compliments hats, even sings snatches of tunes. People smile despite themselves. Dropping change into his cap, he winks at you afterward. "Kid, it ain't about pity," he says. "It's about making folks feel good about helping. Give 'em a story, give 'em a laugh, and they'll give you their nickel." It's part theatre, part psychology, and you realise you're the student again, learning a trade as strange as any. By sundown, you've gathered enough for half a loaf of bread and a cup of weak coffee. You chew the crust slowly, each bite tasting of both victory and shame. Pride wrestles with hunger, and hunger wins. Around the jungle fire that night, others swap tales of their best spare-changing hauls. One man swears he got a whole chicken by helping an old woman carry her groceries. Another brags about charming a store clerk into sneaking him day-old pies. Everyone laughs, but behind the laughter is recognition. You've all been there, hand outstretched, waiting for mercy. When you bed down under the stars, bread sitting heavy in your belly, you realise panhandling isn't just about food. It's about walking the thin line between humiliation and survival, between being invisible and being noticed. Tomorrow you might work a field or hop another train, but tonight you survived because you dared to ask. The first thing you notice about this town is the silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the hush that settles when everyone knows trouble is coming. You've barely stepped off the rails when a cop spots you from across the street. His eyes narrow, hand resting on his baton, and you already know the script. You're not welcome. In the 1930s, many towns had one goal when it came to hobos and transients: get rid of them fast. The official term was vagrancy control. The unofficial method was intimidation, arrest, or a swift beating. Here's the historical fact. During the Depression, countless cities passed ordinances criminalising homelessness. Laws against loitering, sleeping in public, or wandering without visible means of support gave police broad power to arrest anyone who looked like a drifter. In practice, it meant hobos could be jailed for nothing more than existing. Some spent nights in cells, others were forced into the chain gangs, and many were simply escorted to the city limits and told not to come back. Now for the quirky side of it, hobos often had nicknames for especially hostile police. Tin Stars was a common one, but some got more colourful. In one Nebraska town, a sheriff known for cracking heads was nicknamed 2x4 because, rumour had it, he didn't bother with a baton, he used lumber scraps instead. Dark humour again, but it was how hobos softened the fear. If you could laugh at a cop's brutality, maybe you could survive it. The scholarly debate is whether these crackdowns kept order or simply deepened the misery of the poor. Some argue police were overwhelmed, trying to maintain peace in towns suddenly flooded with thousands of starving strangers. Others insist the crackdowns were cruel scapegoating, punishing victims of economic collapse while protecting wealthier citizens' comfort. The argument mirrors today's debates about homelessness, proof that the past never really goes away. Back on the street, the cop barks, "Keep moving." You nod, lower your eyes, and shuffle on. Every instinct screams at you to argue. You're not causing trouble, you're just breathing. But the baton swaying at his side warns you otherwise. You've seen men learn the hard way that pride is no shield against a club, or you try another street, but another officer spots you. He doesn't say a word, just points toward the edge of town. You head that way, heat rising in your chest. You're angry, humiliated, and most of all tired. Sometimes the road feels less like a choice and more like an exile that repeats itself in every new place. At the jungle that night, men trade horror stories. One describes being locked in a cell for a week just for loitering. Another swears he was beaten so badly by a bull and a cop together that he couldn't walk for days. Yet mixed in are tales of small mercies. A sheriff who gave coffee before escorting men out of town, or a deputy who slipped bread to a hungry kid before turning him loose. Authority wasn't always cruel, but it was always unpredictable. You lie back in the dirt, staring at the stars, and wonder what it would be like to enter a town and not be watched, judged, or pushed out. But you know the truth. Hobos live in constant negotiation with power. The rails give freedom, the towns give food, and the cops decide how long you get to stay. Tomorrow you'll move again, not because you want to, but because the law has made you a ghost. As sleep creeps in, the fire popping beside you, you realise something bitter. The world calls you a criminal, but your only cray is surviving without money. And in this America, that's enough to get you chased from every street you step on. By the time you roll it into the next city, the Depression isn't just something you live, it's something you see plastered across billboards, scribbled in song lyrics, and drawn in the Sunday comics. Hobos aren't only in the jungles or the boxcars anymore, they've wandered into popular culture, reimagined as characters half pitiful, half charming. You pause outside a movie theatre, staring at a poster for a comedy short. The image shows a smiling tramp with oversized shoes, patched pants, and a jaunty stick over his shoulder. He looks nothing like the gaunt men you know from the rails, but he's instantly recognisable, the hobo as a cartoon. Here's the hard historical fact. By the mid-30s, hobos were deeply woven into American entertainment. Songs romanticised them, films satirised them, and comic strips used them for humour. Walt Disney's Goofy debuted in 1932 as Dippy Dog, essentially a slapstick hobo with a floppy hat and clumsy charm. Folk singers like Woody Guthrie later embraced the image, blending truth and myth. The real suffering of the road morphed into entertainment for audiences who wanted to laugh or sigh without smelling the beans burning in a jungle fire. Now the quirky angle. Hobos even inspired toys and Halloween costumes. Children dressed as happy tramps, complete with drawn-on stubble and patched overalls, posing for photographs while actual hobos slept under bridges blocks away. There were even hobo parties, where middle-class folks dressed in rags for fun, serving beans and coffee as though poverty were a theme night. It was parody as privilege, and the irony would have made any real hobo choke on his stale bread. Scholars still wrestle with this contradiction. Was the hobo in popular culture a way of softening a painful reality, turning suffering into a digestible story? Or did it erase the truth, making people forget that behind the cartoon was a man freezing to death in a boxcar? Some argue the cultural hobo gave Americans hope, embodying resilience and humour in hard times. Others say it trivialised real suffering, a convenient fantasy that lets society laugh instead of act. Back in the jungle, you hear men debating it themselves. One mutters about kids in town laughing, calling him Bozo the Tramp. Another jokes that at least the cartoons make him look skinnier. They laugh, but you can feel the sting beneath it. None of them look like Hollywood's cheerful wanderers. They look tired, dirty, and old before their time. Yet even they sometimes lean into the stereotype, playing the fool to coax a nickel or a sandwich. The line between parody and reality blurs until even the men living it can't tell the difference. Later that night, someone pulls a harmonica and starts playing Big Rock Candy Mountain. The song paints a dreamland for hobos. Streams of alcohol, cigarette trees, chickens that lay fried eggs. Everyone laughs at the absurdity, but deep down you know it's more than a joke. It's wishful thinking dressed in rhyme, a bedtime story for men who'll sleep on cold dirt instead of candy mountains. The song becomes both parody and prayer. You stretch out by the fire, listening to the laughter fade. The world beyond the rails will keep drawing hobos as clowns and folk heroes, packaging their misery into bite-sized myths. But here in the dirt, the truth is sharper. Cartoons can't keep you warm, and songs can't fill your belly. You realise the biggest gap in the Depression isn't between rich and poor, it's between the image of hobos and the reality of them. And every mile you ride, you're living in the shadow of both. The rails stretch on, and with them comes a truth you can't escape. When everything else is stripped away, faith has a way of sneaking back in. You've seen it before, men crossing themselves before hopping a train, women clutching rosaries in Hoovervilles, preachers booming sermons in soup kitchens. Out here, survival isn't just beans and bread. It's belief, sometimes in God, sometimes in luck, sometimes in nothing more than the rhythm of the rails carrying you one more mile. Here's the historical fact anchoring this. The Depression years saw a surge in mission work, especially from churches that ran soup lines, shelters, and revival tents near rail yards. Missions often offered food and beds, but only after a sermon. To a hobo with an empty belly, that meant sitting through an hour of fiery preaching in exchange for soup. Attendance wasn't always about salvation. Sometimes it was just about calories. Still, many carried scraps of scripture or spiritual habits, whispering prayers before sleep. Now the quirky detail. Hobos sometimes developed their own superstitions, blending faith with folklore. Some believed whistling while hopping a train was bad luck. Others swore you should never take the first bowl of beans in a jungle pot. It was cursed with hunger. One even told you dead serious that rubbing a rabbit's foot before riding kept the bulls away. Whether it was God, luck, or nonsense, belief gave structure to chaos. And here's the scholarly debate. Was faith on the rails genuine devotion, or just transactional survival? Did men truly find solace in prayer, or were they simply enduring sermons for food? Some argue that hardship deepened religious feeling, producing a generation that clung tighter to faith. Others suggest most rail riders were cynical, muttering amens with empty stomachs and rolling their eyes as soon as they left. Both sides hold water, because belief is slippery. You can be both skeptic and believer when hunger drives you to your knees. In one town, you wander into a tent revival pitched right beside the tracks. Inside, lanterns swing as a preacher bellows about redemption, sweat pouring down his face. The crowd is a mix of hobos, townsfolk, and curious kids all swaying to the rhythm of hymns. You sing along despite barely remembering the words, your voice blending into the chorus. For a moment, the tent feels like shelter, not just from the rain, but from despair itself. When the hymn ends, plates of cornbread appear, and you eat with both hands. Was it the spirit that saved you tonight, or just the food? Maybe both. Later, back at the jungle, the fire circle hums with the quieter faith. A man recites Psalm 23 from memory, his voice low but steady. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Heads nod, eyes close. Another man speaks not of God, but of luck, claiming he's lived this long because he never travels on Fridays. A third just stares into the flames, whispering to no one. Out here, faith takes whatever shape it needs to keep a man upright. When you lie down under the stars, belly full of cornbread and ears still ringing from the hymns, you can't help but wonder, What do you believe in? God, luck, or the iron rails themselves? Maybe it doesn't matter. Belief, like beans, is passed around the fire, and even if you don't swallow it whole, you take enough to get through another night. By now the rails have taught you plenty about hunger and cold, but tonight you learn another lesson: how to doctor wounds when there's no doctor in sight. It starts when a man by the fire curses, pulling off his shoe to reveal a blister that looks more like a battlefield. No clinic, no pharmacy, just a circle of rail riders offering cures they swear will work. The hobo world runs on improvisation, and medicine is no exception. Here's the firm historical fact. With hospitals expensive and charity wards overcrowded, most hobos relied on folk remedies during the Depression. They treated infections with kerosene, rubbed bacon fat on frostbite, and wrapped wounds in rags soaked with turpentine. It wasn't always effective. In fact, sometimes it made things worse. But when you're broke and far from town, even bad medicine feels like hope. Now for the quirky nugget. Some hobos carried medicine kits that looked more like toolboxes than first aid supplies. One man you meet has a pouch with garlic cloves, tobacco and a flask of whiskey, insisting those three things can fix anything from a toothache to a broken heart. Another pulls out a rusty spoon he uses to drain boils, grinning as if it's a badge of honour. Hurt like hell, he brags, but it worked. You can't tell if he's tough or just half mad, maybe both. The scholarly debate here is sharp. Were these remedies a testament to resilience or a tragic sign of neglect? Some historians emphasise the ingenuity of hobos creating cures from scraps, framing it as proof of survival skills. Others argue it highlights how badly society failed them. When whiskey and onion poultices are your only option, it's less resourcefulness than desperation. The truth, as always, is tangled like the weeds growing around the jungle fires. You watch as one man sprinkles tobacco on a cut, claiming it draws out the poison. Another swears by wrapping newspaper tight around sore joints for heat. Someone else coughs violently, spitting into the dirt, and another hobo presses a rag soaked in vinegar to his chest. None of it looks convincing, but the firelight makes every cure seem holy, every remedy worth a try. Out here, belief is half the treatment. Later, a younger rider pulls you aside, showing you a burn from a hot coal. You remember a trick you'd overheard weeks ago: dab the burn with wet mud, keep it covered until morning. You smear it on him and he winces but nods. Will it work? Who knows? But for a few hours he believes it will. And sometimes belief does more healing than medicine. That night the fire dies down, and you curl up against the cold with a rag tied around your wrist, a scratch stinging beneath it. You whisper to yourself that it'll heal, that the salt water you washed it with was enough. You know it might not be true, but hope, like vinegar and whiskey, is the closest thing to medicine the road ever gives you. When you drift into uneasy sleep, you realise this. The hobo pharmacy is built not of pills or powders, but of scraps, rumours, and stubborn faith in things that shouldn't work but sometimes do. And for now, that's enough to keep you breathing another night. The next day, while riding a flat car into a sleepy town, you meet a man with something strange in his pocket. He pulls out a nickel, but it doesn't look like any coin you've ever seen. The edges are shaved and the face of the buffalo has been carved away, replaced by the rough outline of a hobo's own portrait, complete with floppy hat and wide grin. He holds it out proudly like it's worth a fortune. "Hobo nickel," he says, as if that explains everything. Here's the grounded fact. Hobo nickels were real folk art of the rails. The US buffalo nickel, minted between 1913 and 1938, was soft enough that with a pocket knife or nail, a man could carve new images onto its surface. Hobos reworked the Native American face into portraits of fellow wanderers, soldiers, clowns, or even loved ones. They traded these tiny artworks for food, tobacco, or a spot by the fire. The coins weren't legal tender anymore. They were better. They carried a story. Now for the quirky detail. Some hobos signed their work with little symbols hidden in the design, a secret artist's mark. One popular motif was turning the buffalo on the coin's reverse into a donkey, a dog, or in one case a dragon with smoke curling from its mouth. Imagine trading a dragon-carved nickel for a bowl of beans. To the outside world, it was just defaced currency. To hobos, it was a talisman, a keepsake, sometimes even a calling card ascended. And here's the scholarly debate. Were hobo nickels simply survival tools? Art traded for meals? Or were they genuine contributions to American folk art? Collectors today pay hundreds, even thousands, for authentic Depression-era carvings. Some scholars argue they're masterpieces of outsider creativity, while others dismiss them as crude doodles born of boredom. The debate lingers in museums and auction houses, but on the rails, no one argued. A hobo nickel was proof you had skill, patience, and something to offer besides sweat. The man passes the coin around the fire, and each hand lingers a little longer than necessary, as if touching it gives luck. When it lands in your palm, you trace the grooves with your thumb, marvelling at how a dull knife and endless hours could turn money into memory. You picture the artist hunched by a campfire, carving slowly as sparks popped, trading hunger for art stroke by stroke. Later that night, another hobo pulls out his own crude carving. His shows a skull where the Indian head should be. He chuckles, saying, "Made this after my buddy got thrown off the rails. Keeps me reminded." It's grim, but also oddly beautiful. Out here, coins aren't just for spending, they're for remembering, for leaving marks no railroad bull can erase. You wonder what you'd carve if you had a nickel and a knife. Maybe a train wheel, maybe a star, maybe just your initials to prove you existed at all. But for now, you hand the coin back, reluctant to let it go. The firelight glints off its carved surface, a shimmer of survival disguised as art. When you bed down that night, you realise the hobo nickel isn't just a coin. It's a symbol of what the road forces you to do. Take something ordinary, worn and nearly worthless, and carve it into something new, something that carries your story forward. You drift into sleep imagining a pocketful of such coins, each one etched with a more of the memory, jingling like proof that you didn't just wander, you lived. The rails eventually carry you into a town buzzing louder than most. Banners flap across storefronts, posters plaster the walls, and men in suits shake hands at every corner. It's an election year, and politicians have discovered what every hobo already knows. You can't ignore the crowd at the bottom. The speeches promise jobs, bread, dignity restored. You stand at the edge of the square with a knot of other wanderers, listening as some silver-tongued candidate bellows about a New Deal for the common man. His words are bold, but your stomach still growls, and the fire in your gut isn't hope, it's hunger. Here's the historical fact. The early 30s were political earthquakes. Hoover tried to downplay the Depression, insisting prosperity was just around the corner. By 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt swept in with promises of a New Deal, speaking directly to the unemployed. Politicians suddenly treated hobos and migrants not as invisible, but as potential voices in the national cry. Of course, most hobos couldn't even vote, no fixed address meant no registration, but their presence shaped the imagery of the time. Candidates used them as proof of national crisis. Now the quirky detail, hobos sometimes heckled campaign stops for free food. One story tells of a group who crashed a rally shouting, "Promising pie in the sky, don't fill our bellies." Embarrassed aides scrambled to hand out sandwiches, and the hobos walked away grinning, declaring it the best campaign lunch they'd ever had. In another case, a man claimed he shook Roosevelt's hand while sneaking 2 apples from a nearby barrel. He swore the president winked at him, though chances are that detail was pure invention. The scholarly debate around politics and hobos boils down to this. Were politicians truly attentive to their plight, or were hobos just convenient symbols of suffering? Some argue Roosevelt's New Deal programs, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, were lifelines, giving wanderers a chance to earn food and shelter. Others note that many hobos were left out entirely, too transient to fit government categories. The debate still rages in history books. Did the political system help them, or simply use them? Back in the square, you watch as the crowd cheers, townsfolk wave signs chanting slogans, while hobos hang back near the alleys, hoping for discarded sandwiches. A campaign worker eyes you suspiciously before chewing you along, but not before you snag a crust of bread from a platter. You chew it, while the candidate thunders about prosperity, the irony sharp as vinegar. Later in the jungle, the fire circle becomes its own political stage. Men argue fiercely. One insists Roosevelt is the only hope, another mutters that all politicians are liars. Someone else quotes a radical pamphlet, declaring capitalism dead. The debate is fiery but pointless. None of you have ballots. Still, the arguing keeps the night alive. The flames of hunger fanned into talk instead of despair. As you lie back, watching sparks spin upward into the night, you realise politics is another kind of train. It roars through towns full of noise and promise, but by the time it passes, you're left standing in the dust, clutching crumbs. You want to believe the rails of politics lead somewhere better, but for now, they feel just as uncertain as the ones you ride. The next leg of the journey teaches you something unspoken but undeniable. Not everyone rides the rails the same way. You've noticed it in whispers around campfires, in the way some hobos sit apart, and in the chalk marks warning trouble for coloured folks. Tonight, by the fire, an older black hobo named Sam lays it out plain. "It's hard enough out here for you," he says, poking the flames with a stick. "Now imagine the same road with Jim Crow strapped to your back." His words hang in the smoky air, heavier than hunger. Here's the historical truth. While the Depression brutalised everyone, black hobos faced double the weight: poverty and racism. In the South, vagrancy laws were used aggressively to arrest black men, sometimes forcing them into chain gangs. Even in northern states, rail yard bulls and local cops targeted them more harshly. White hobos might get chased out of town. Black hobos often got beaten, jailed, or worse. Riding the rails wasn't just risky, it was life-threatening in a different, sharper way. Now the quirky, almost unbelievable fact. Some black hobos carried musical passports. A harmonica or guitar wasn't just entertainment, it was protection. If stopped by the police or locals, a quick song could sometimes shift the situation, turning suspicion into novelty. "Play us a tune," they'd demand. And for a few minutes, music brought mercy. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, but it was strategy. Instruments became shields as much as they were solace. The scholarly debate here is about solidarity. Did white and black hobos truly share the road as equals, bound by the same hunger? Or were the divisions of Jim Crow too strong, even in the jungles? Some accounts describe mixed camps where men of every background shared beans and fire without question. Others recall fights, exclusions, or separate circles where the colour line cut through even poverty's brotherhood. Historians still argue whether hobo life erased divisions or simply reproduced them in rougher form. Back at the fire, Sam tells stories of riding trains through Mississippi, dodging sheriffs who'd arrest him just for walking. He describes sneaking into boxcars only to have white hobos kick him out, fearing they'd draw more heat if caught with him. "Still," he says, voice softening, "sometimes I found brothers out here. Men who shared their bread, didn't care what colour my skin was. You hold on to those nights. They're rare, but they're real." The fire circle nods in silence. No one argues. Hunger unites, but history divides, and everyone knows it. You feel the weight of it too, realising your own survival doesn't carry the same risks as his. The road is cruel, but it's not equally cruel later. As the fire burns low, Sam pulls out a harmonica and plays a blues riff that drifts into the night like smoke. It's raw, aching, yet somehow steady. You lie back, letting the notes soak into your bones, and think about how the rails promise freedom, but deliver it unevenly. Tomorrow, you'll all ride the same train, but not with the same dangers waiting at the next stop. You fall asleep to the blues, understanding that the road is both shared and divided, a paradox that hums in every note Sam plays. Out here, equality is as fragile as the flame, and sometimes it flickers out before dawn. The first frost hits like a slap. You wake up with your breath puffing in the air, jacket stiff from dew, and fingers so numb you can barely lace your boots. Summer wandering was one thing, but winter on the rails is a different kind of beast. It doesn't just test your hunger or your courage, it tests whether your body can endure cold that creeps into your bones and refuses to leave. Survival now isn't about charm or luck, it's about keeping your blood moving. Here's the stark historical fact. Winters during the Depression killed thousands of homeless men and women. Newspapers occasionally ran small notes about bodies found frozen in boxcars or under bridges, but most deaths went uncounted. Without insulated clothes or steady shelter, hobos improvised. They stuffed newspapers inside coats for insulation, scavenged coal from rail yards, and huddled like animals around jungle fires. Cold, more than hunger, became the silent killer. Now for the quirky trick. Hobos sometimes stole chunks of coal by tossing them off the trains as they moved, then doubling back later to collect the loot. Others claimed shredded cardboard made better insulation than wool, if you layered it right. One man you meet swears by stuffing grass into his shoes. It makes him walk like he's wearing haystacks, but he insists it beats frostbite. The road teaches you to value anything that traps heat, no matter how ridiculous it looks. The scholarly debate is whether hobos' winter strategies reflected ingenuity or sheer desperation. Some historians admire their resourcefulness, pointing out how men crafted shelters, fires, and clothing hacks from nothing. Others emphasize how many froze anyway, arguing that no amount of hobo cleverness could offset systemic neglect. The disagreement boils down to perspective. Do you celebrate survival tricks, or mourn how little they achieved? Back in the jungle, you huddle with others around a fire, watching sparks dance like tiny comets. A man beside you unwraps a newspaper from under his coat, the ink smeared onto his shirt. "Keeps me warmer than Roosevelt's promises," he jokes, and everyone laughs, though the sound is brittle. Another man blows on his hands, palms cracked and bleeding. Someone passes a flask, the whiskey biting like fire. It doesn't warm your body, but it makes you forget the cold for a few minutes, and sometimes that's the same thing. When the fire dies low, you bed down with layers of rags wrapped around your feet. The ground steals your heat anyway, leaving your teeth chattering. You drift into half-sleep, dreaming of heavy blankets, hot stoves, and the smell of stew simmering in a warm kitchen. But dawn comes cold and grey, reminding you those comforts belong to another world. Later in town, you pass a storefront window where mannequins wear thick coats, their collars trimmed with fur. You press your nose to the glass, then pull away quickly when a clerk glares. You can't afford the coat, but you can't afford not to imagine it either. Daydreams become another form of insulation, thin but better than nothing. That night, you steal a sliver of coal from a passing train, stuffing it under your coat like contraband gold. Back at the jungle, you toss it into the fire, and the flames flare brighter. Everyone leans closer, faces glowing orange. For a few hours, the cold loses its grip, and the world feels almost bearable. As you curl into your coat again, you realise winter isn't just a season out here, it's an enemy. And survival means fighting it with paper, coal, rags, and stubbornness. Tomorrow will be just as cold, but tonight, the fire wins. By now, you've seen enough to know that the rails aren't just iron and smoke, they're a thread stitching together a strange, invisible family. You call each other brother, not because you share blood, but because you share beans, bruises, and the same hollow hunger. Around the fire tonight, you feel that bond more strongly than ever. A man you met only yesterday hands you half his bread without hesitation. Another leans over to patch a rip in your coat with a spare scrap of cloth. It's not charity, it's instinct. Out here, kindness is as necessary as food. Here's the firm historical fact. Despite the stereotypes of crime and lawlessness, hobos developed strong codes of mutual aid. The hobo code wasn't just about chalk marks on fences, it was about treating fellow wanderers with respect. Many memoirs describe how men pulled their food, cared for the sick, and passed on survival knowledge. In a world where mainstream society rejected them, hobos built their own version of brotherhood. Now the quirky side, some jungles even had rituals for new arrivals. In one, a man would be asked to share a story before receiving food. No story, no beans. In another, the rule was to contribute something, anything, a stick of wood, a song, a joke. Even laughter could be a form of currency. These rituals turned the most ragtag camps into communities with their own traditions, as if the road itself demanded ceremony. The scholarly debate here asks, was this brotherhood romanticised after the fact, or was it truly the backbone of hobo life? Some argue memoirs exaggerated the hobo family to create a myth of solidarity, smoothing over the darker reality of theft and violence. Others insist the bonds were genuine, forged out of necessity. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Brotherhood where it mattered, betrayal where hunger pushed too hard. Around the fire, the talk drifts to men you've never met but somehow know. Names echo like legends. Big Tom, who once fought off 3 bulls, Smiling Jack, who could charm a pie from any kitchen window. Stories pass like heirlooms, keeping the absent alive. You realise the brotherhood extends beyond the circle. It stretches across states, miles and years, bound by tales carried from one jungle to another. Later, a man shivers violently, fever burning his skin. Without discussion, others shuffle blankets and rags his way. Someone presses a cup of hot water into his hands, another dribbles whiskey onto his lips. Nobody asks for repayment. The unspoken agreement is simple. Today it's him, tomorrow it could be you. Brotherhood doesn't keep you from suffering, but it makes suffering less lonely. When the fire burns low, you find yourself humming alongside the others, a wordless tune rising into the night. It's not planned, not rehearsed. It just happens, voices overlapping, till it feels like one sound made by many throats. You lie back on the dirt, coat pulled tight, listening to the collective murmur. For the first time in weeks, you don't feel like a ghost drifting from town to town. You feel like part of something, however fragile, however temporary. As you close your eyes, you realise this is what the road offers when it's at its best. Not comfort, not wealth, not even soul and in safety, but belonging. The rails may shatter you tomorrow, but tonight, under the stars, you're held together by firelight and fellowship. Morning breaks soft and grey, the fire burned down to ash, and you know the journey is nearing its end. The rails hum in the distance like they always do, promising both freedom and exile. You sit up slowly, coat stiff with dirt, and look around at the men who've become your brothers for a night. Some are already gone, melted into the dawn without farewells. That's the way of it. Arrivals and departures, always unfinished. The hobo world doesn't do permanence. It does passing moments stitched into memory. Here's the historical anchor for this chapter. By the end of the 1930s, the number of hobos began to decline. Roosevelt's New Deal programs, like the Civilian Conservation Corps and Works Progress Administration, pulled many men off the rails and into jobs building roads, bridges, and parks. World War II, grim as it was, finished the shift by drafting millions into military service and ramping up factory work. The hobo life didn't vanish overnight, but it shrank, fading into folklore as the economy revived. Now the quirky detail. The culture didn't disappear, it transformed. Hobo gatherings called conventions sprang up, with mock elections for the King of the Hobos. One famous figure, Leon Ray Livingston, known as Ano One, became a legend, writing books about his travels and cementing the myth of the hobo wanderer. Today, collectors still hunt for carved hobo nickels, and in Britt, Iowa, there's an annual National Hobo Convention where the traditions, songs, codes, and symbols and bean feasts live on. The rails may no longer thunder with armies of hobos, but their spirit found new ways to ride. And here's the scholarly debate. Should hobos be remembered as resilient survivors, or as tragic casualties of a broken system? Some historians frame them as folk heroes, proof of American grit and resourcefulness. Others stress the trauma, the violence, the countless dead whose names never made it to songs or books. The debate matters because it shapes whether we romanticize poverty or confront it honestly. Were hobos icons of freedom or warnings of failure? The truth, like the rails, runs both directions. You stand, stretch, and feel the road in your bones. You know now that survival wasn't just beans and bread. It was code scratched in chalk, nickels carved into art, brotherhood around jungle fires, music in boxcars, and prayers whispered into the night. Hobos endured with no money, no homes, and often no safety, but they carried something harder to kill: stubbornness. They refused to vanish quietly, even when the country wished they would. As you walk toward the tracks one last time, you hear echoes of everything you've lived through. The clatter of harmonicas, the scrape of spoons in soup kitchens, the crunch of cardboard shoes, the laughter of kids who turned misery into games. You carry those sounds like souvenirs. The depression may end, the rails may quiet, but the lessons of the hobo life will never completely fade. When the train whistle calls, you climb aboard, gripping the cold iron and hauling yourself into the moving dark. Ahead lies another town, another fire, another story, but this time, you know you're not just passing through, you're part of a legacy stitched together by hunger, courage, and the will to keep moving, even when the world gave you nothing. The hobo is fading into history now, but the resilience remains. And maybe, just maybe, when you hear the low hum of a train at night, you'll think of them, those men and women who survived with empty pockets but full determination, carving their place in history without a single dollar to their name. And now, as the rails quiet and the fires dim, it's time to let go of the journey. You've walked through shantytowns, dodged bulls, warmed your hands on jungle flames, and listened to music rise above hunger. You've seen children ride boxcars, women disguise themselves as men, and strangers become brothers in the dirt. It was never easy. Truth is, most of the time it was brutal, but the story of the hobos proves that even when stripped of everything, people will cling to scraps of dignity, humour, and hope. Close your eyes and imagine it one last time. The chalk marks on a fence post, guiding you to a safe house, the smoky taste of beans shared with strangers, the hum of a harmonica drifting through a boxcar at midnight. Picture the carved nickel passed from hand to hand, a tiny piece of art outlasting the miles. Think of the laughter in the face of hardship, the whispered prayers under the stars, the stubborn refusal to stop moving. That's the spirit you're carrying with you now. The Great Depression eventually loosened its grip and the hobos faded from the rails. But their lessons remain stitched into history. Survival isn't always about wealth or strength. It's about sharing, adapting, and refusing to disappear. As you drift towards sleep, let the rhythm of those old trains lull you, steady and soft. Each clack of the rails is a heartbeat, carrying stories forward. Reminding you that even in the hardest times, resilience hums beneath the noise. So rest easy. The journey's done, the fire's out, and the road ahead can wait until tomorrow. Sweet dreams, traveller.